The leather beneath Julia Kennedy's hands was as worn and cracked as her heart, each stitch pulling through the saddle like thread through an old wound that refused to heal properly. She worked alone in the small shop her father had built in Tahlequah, Cherokee Nation, the Indian territory that would one day become Oklahoma. Though in this year of 1878, such thoughts seemed impossibly distant. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty window, casting long shadows across the workbench where generations of saddles, bridles, and reins had been crafted with careful precision. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in memories she could not escape, and a grief that colored everything she touched. Julia was 23 years old and felt ancient. The war had taken her father when she was just a girl, leaving her mother to raise her alone until consumption claimed her too. 3 years passed. Now Julia lived in the rooms above the shop, working leather from dawn until darkness fell. Her only companions the smell of tanning oil and the rhythmic tap of her tools. People in town whispered about her, the young woman who chose isolation over society, who turned down suitors with barely a glance, who seemed determined to live and die as alone as the saddles that hung from her rafters. The bell above the door chimed, and Julia looked up to see a customer silhouetted in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dust coating his clothes and a weariness in his posture that spoke of long miles traveled. As he stepped inside and removed his hat, she could see he was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. "I need work done," he said, his voice rough from the trail. "My saddle took damage coming through the mountains." Stirrup leather tore clean through. Julia nodded and gestured for him to bring it forward. He carried the saddle with the easy strength of a man accustomed to such burdens, laying it carefully on her workbench. She examined the damage with professional attention, running her fingers along the torn leather, assessing the repair needed. "I can fix this," she said quietly. "It will take 2 days, maybe 3. That is fine. I am not in a particular hurry." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You are very young to run a shop like this alone. I manage. I did not mean offense. The work here looks excellent." He gestured to the saddles hanging from the walls, the bridles arranged with careful precision. "My name is William Hayes. I have been riding for the Bar T Ranch, but I am looking to settle somewhere more permanent. Tahlequah seems like a decent town. It suits some people." Julia turned back to the saddle, hoping he would take the hint and leave. Instead, he lingered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "You have a name I can use when I return, Julia Kennedy. Come back Thursday afternoon." William Hayes settled his hat back on his head but did not immediately move toward the door. "You seem sad," he said, the words direct but not unkind. "Like you are stitching all that sadness right into the leather." Julia's hand stilled. She looked up at him, startled by his observation, by the way he had seen through her careful walls in mere minutes. "I do not know what you mean." "I think you do." He met her gaze steadily. "I have known that kind of sadness myself. It gets into everything if you let it." For a long moment they stood in silence, the air between them charged with something Julia could not name. Then William nodded once and turned toward the door. "Thursday," he said, and was gone. Julia returned to her work, but her concentration had shattered. She found herself thinking about the cowboy's words, about the way he had looked at her as though he truly saw her, not just the solitary leatherworker but the woman beneath. It unsettled her in ways she could not quite articulate. That evening, as she prepared a simple supper in her rooms above the shop, Julia found herself wondering about William Hayes. Where had he come from? What had brought that sadness into his eyes, the sadness he claimed to recognize in her? She told herself it did not matter, that he was simply another customer who would collect his repaired saddle and ride out of her life as quickly as he had entered it. But sleep came slowly that night, and her dreams were full of storm-cloud eyes and voices that spoke of shared sorrow. The next morning, Julia began work on William's saddle with more care than usual. She selected the finest leather from her stores, cutting and shaping it with meticulous precision. As her needle pulled through the material, she realized she was humming softly, a tune her mother used to sing while working in their small garden. When had she last hummed while working? When had anything felt like more than just mechanical motion designed to fill the empty hours? The bell chimed again around mid-morning. Julia looked up, half expecting to see William Hayes returned already, but instead found herself facing Mrs. Patterson, one of the town's most persistent gossips. "Miss Kennedy, I need a new bridle for my husband's horse. The old one finally gave out, Mrs." Patterson's sharp eyes scanned the shop, missing nothing. "I heard you had a visitor yesterday, a cowboy, tall fellow. Word is he was in here quite a while for a simple repair consultation." Julia kept her expression neutral. "The repair required proper assessment. I gave it the time it needed." Of course. Mrs. Patterson's smile was knowing. "Still, it is unusual for you to entertain male visitors at all. Some might say it is progress. Some might say it was business, which it was." Julia pulled out her sample bridles. "What style does your husband prefer?" They concluded the transaction quickly, though not before Mrs. Patterson managed to inquire 3 more times about William Hayes in increasingly indirect ways. When she finally left, Julia felt exhausted by the interaction, reminded sharply of why she preferred the company of leather and tools to people. Yet as she returned to William's saddle, she found herself thinking about what Mrs. Patterson had said. Was it really so strange that a customer had stayed to talk for a few extra minutes? Did the whole town really watch her that closely, noting every deviation from her solitary routine? The thought was suffocating. Julia worked steadily through the afternoon, completing the major repairs on the saddle. The leather took the stitching beautifully, and she found satisfaction in watching the torn pieces come together, made whole again through patient effort. If only human hearts could be mended so simply, with needle and thread and skilled hands. That evening, restless and unable to settle, Julia took a rare walk through town. Tahlequah was peaceful in the gathering dusk, lights beginning to glow in windows, the sound of conversation drifting from the saloon on Main Street. She walked past the general store, the church, the small schoolhouse where Cherokee children learned their letters alongside the children of white settlers who had made the territory their home. She was returning toward her shop when she saw him. William Hayes stood outside the hotel, talking with another man she did not recognize. Even from a distance, she could see the easy way he held himself, the gestures of his hands as he spoke. Then, as though sensing her gaze, he turned and saw her. For a moment, Julia considered simply walking past with a brief nod, maintaining the professional distance she had cultivated so carefully. But something in his expression stopped her, a genuine pleasure at seeing her that seemed entirely without calculation. "Miss Kennedy," he called, stepping away from his companion. "An evening walk. I needed air." She was acutely aware of how strange she must seem, the reclusive leatherworker actually out among people. "Your saddle is coming along well. It should be ready by Thursday as promised. I am grateful." He fell into step beside her as she continued walking, his companion disappearing into the hotel. "I spent today looking at properties. There is a small ranch about 5 miles out, needs work but has good bones. The owner is willing to sell at a fair price." You are serious about settling here then? I am tired of drifting. William's voice was quiet but firm. A man needs roots somewhere. I have been riding from place to place for years, never belonging anywhere. That is no way to live. Julia understood that sentiment more than she cared to admit. And you think Tahlequah will suit you? I think anywhere can suit a person if they find the right reasons to stay. He glanced at her, something meaningful in his look. Sometimes it just takes meeting the right people. They walked in silence for a few moments, the evening air cooling around them. Julia found herself more comfortable than she had expected, his presence somehow easy despite being nearly a stranger. "What brought you to this life?" William asked. "Running the leather shop alone, I mean. That cannot have been what you imagined as a girl." Julia considered deflecting, offering the brief impersonal answer she usually gave when forced to discuss herself. But something about the genuine interest in his voice, the lack of prurient curiosity, made her want to be honest. "My father was the leatherworker. He taught me the trade from the time I was small. My mother thought it unladylike, but he insisted I needed skills that could support me. He died when I was 14, fighting in a skirmish that had no name and no real purpose. My mother and I carried on for a while, but then she got sick. The consumption took her slowly. By the time I was 20, I was alone with the shop and a lot of grief I did not know how to process. So you stitched it into the leather." William's words were soft, understanding. "Something like that." Julia surprised herself by continuing. "Every saddle, every bridle, every repair, they all carry pieces of what I have lost. I thought if I could just keep working, keep creating, eventually the sadness would work itself out. But it has been 3 years and I still feel it in every stitch." "Grief does not work like that," William said. "You cannot work it out alone like removing splinters. It needs to be shared, carried by more than one person." They had reached the shop. Julia paused with her hand on the door, looking up at him in the gathering darkness. "You sound like you speak from experience." "I lost my parents and 2 sisters to scarlet fever when I was 19. I was away working on a ranch, and by the time I got the message and rode home, they were already buried. I spent years after that riding, working, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. I told myself it was easier that way, that if I never cared about anyone, I would never hurt like that again." "What changed?" William smiled, a sad, gentle expression. "I realized I was not avoiding pain. I was just replacing one kind with another. Loneliness hurts too, Miss Kennedy. Sometimes worse than grief, because at least grief means you had something worth mourning." Julia felt tears prickling at her eyes, the first she had allowed herself in months. "I do not know how to be any other way. This is who I have become. Then maybe it is time to become someone new." He reached out, not quite touching her, his hand hovering near her shoulder. "You do not have to carry all that sadness alone, and you do not have to stitch it into everything you create. There is room in this world for joy too, if you let yourself reach for it." She looked at him through the blur of tears, this cowboy who had walked into her shop barely a day ago and somehow seen straight through to the core of her. "I do not even know you. Then get to know me. I will be here, working on that ranch, building something permanent. I am not going anywhere." His voice was steady, sure. "But only if you want that. I will not push where I am not welcome." Julia wiped at her eyes, feeling raw and exposed and strangely alive. "Come for supper tomorrow night, after the shop closes. I will cook something and we can talk more." William's face lit with genuine pleasure. "I would like that very much." He tipped his hat and walked away into the darkness, leaving Julia standing in her doorway, her heart beating faster than it had in years. She climbed the stairs to her rooms, her mind spinning with what she had just done. Inviting a man to supper, opening even the smallest door to connection after so long alone. It felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. That night, she lay awake planning the meal, thinking about what she would say, how she would behave. Part of her wanted to run from the vulnerability of it all. But another part, a part she had thought long dead, whispered that maybe William Hayes was right. Maybe it was time to stitch something other than sadness into the fabric of her days. The next day passed in a strange blur. Julia completed William's saddle, the repair seamless and strong, perhaps the finest work she had done in months. She also worked on Mrs. Patterson's bridal order and 2 other small jobs, but her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. Around mid-afternoon, she closed the shop early and went to the general store, purchasing ingredients for a proper meal. Mr. Chen, who ran the store, raised his eyebrows when he saw her selections. "Cooking for company, Miss Kennedy." "Just trying something new," she replied, keeping her tone neutral, but Mr. Chen smiled knowingly. "It is good to see. You have been alone too long." By the time William knocked on her door that evening, Julia had worked herself into a state of nervous energy. She had changed her dress 3 times, arranged and rearranged the small table in her sitting room, and second-guessed every element of the meal she had prepared. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, cleaned up from the trail dust, his hair still damp from washing, his eyes warm and uncertain, some of her anxiety melted away. "Come in," she said, stepping back to let him enter. William looked around the rooms with genuine interest, taking in the simple but tidy space, the few personal items that revealed glimpses of who she was. A photograph of her parents on the mantel, a shelf of well-worn books, a quilt that had clearly been made with love, its colors faded from age. "You have made a real home here," he said. "I have tried." Julia gestured to the table. "Please sit. I hope you are hungry." The meal was simple but good, beef stew with vegetables and fresh bread from the bakery. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing more easily than Julia had expected. William told her about his years drifting, about the ranches where he had worked, the towns he had passed through, the slow realization that motion was not the same as living. "I saved my wages," he explained. "Never had much to spend them on, so I just kept putting money aside. Now I have enough to buy that ranch, stock it properly, build something lasting. That must feel good, having a clear purpose." "It does and it does not." William set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. "A ranch is all well and good, but it is just land and buildings without people to share it with. I suppose I am hoping that settling here will help me build a real life, not just property." Julia understood what he was implying, the hope underlying his words. "You cannot have been alone all these years. Surely there were women interested in a hard-working man with prospects. There were offers." He met her gaze directly. "But I was not ready. I was still running, still too wrapped up in what I had lost to see what I might gain. It is only recently that I have felt like I might be ready to stop running." "What changed?" Julia found herself genuinely curious. William was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "I was in Texas, working on a big ranch down there. There was another cowboy, older fellow named Martin. He had been everywhere, done everything, and he was the loneliest person I ever met. One night, we were riding night watch together, and he just started talking. Told me about all the choices he had made, all the people he had walked away from because he was too scared or too proud or too stubborn to let himself need anyone. He was 60 years old and utterly alone, and he said it was the biggest mistake of his life. That must have been hard to hear. It was like looking at my future if I did not change course." William's voice was soft but intense. "I decided then that I did not want to be 60 and full of regrets. I wanted to find a place and make it home, find people and let them matter, find a woman and build a life with her. Not someday, not eventually, but soon, while I still had time to do it right. Julia felt her breath catch. And you think Tahlequah is that place? I think it might be. His gaze was steady, meaningful. Especially if I have reasons to stay. The air between them felt charged with possibility. Julia stood, busying herself with clearing plates to cover her sudden nervousness. I made coffee. Would you like some, please? They moved to the sitting area with their coffee, settling into the worn but comfortable chairs. The conversation shifted to lighter topics. Books they had read, places they hoped to see, small observations about life in Tahlequah and the Indian Territory. Julia found herself laughing, actually laughing, at William's story about a stubborn horse that had refused to be broken until it decided, entirely on its own terms, that it was ready to cooperate. Animals have their own logic, he said, grinning. Sometimes you just have to respect it. I think people are the same way, Julia replied. You cannot force healing or connection. It happens when the time is right. Is the time right for you now? William's question was gentle but direct. Julia looked at him, this man who had appeared in her life with such sudden and unexpected impact. I think it might be. I am scared, though. I have been alone so long, I do not know if I remember how to be any other way. We can learn together. William leaned forward, his expression earnest. I am not expecting you to suddenly be someone you are not. I just want a chance to know you, to let you know me. If something grows from that, wonderful. If not, at least we will have tried. That seems fair. Julia smiled, feeling a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. I would like to get to know you better, William Hayes. Then we have an understanding. He stood, recognizing that the evening had reached its natural conclusion. Thank you for the meal and the company. Both were exactly what I needed. Julia walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him go. Come by the shop tomorrow. Your saddle is ready. I will be there. He paused in the doorway, looking down at her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. And Julia, I am glad I walked into your shop when I did. I think we both needed this. After he left, Julia stood in her sitting room, touching her lips where a smile kept forming without her permission. The apartment felt different somehow, less like a refuge from the world and more like a place where good things might happen. She cleaned up the remains of their meal with unusual energy, her mind full of William's words, his steady presence, the feeling that something in her life was beginning to shift in unexpected ways. The next morning, William arrived at the shop just after opening. He examined his repaired saddle with the practiced eye of someone who knew quality work when he saw it. This is excellent, he said, running his fingers over the new leather, testing the stitching. Better than it was originally, I think. I take pride in my work. Julia accepted his payment, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. Will you need anything else? Not for the saddle. William shouldered the repaired tack easily. But I was hoping you might join me on Sunday for a ride out to see the property I am buying. I would value your opinion on the place. Julia's first instinct was to decline, to retreat back into the safety of her solitude. But she thought about their conversation the previous evening, about William's words regarding loneliness and living. What time? Early afternoon. I can bring a gentle horse for you if you do not have one. My father's horse is still in the livery. They keep him exercised for me. I will meet you there at 1 o'clock. William's smile was bright enough to light the dim shop. I will count the hours. The days until Sunday passed with strange slowness. Julia found herself thinking about William at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, whether he thought of her too. She caught herself humming while she worked, startling customers who had never heard her make any sound beyond the necessary minimum. Mrs. Patterson came by on Saturday with knowing looks and barely veiled questions about the cowboy who had been seen leaving Julia's apartment after dark earlier in the week. "We simply had supper," Julia said firmly. "As friends do." "Of course, dear." Though friendship has a way of becoming more, given time and opportunity. Mrs. Patterson's expression was almost kind beneath the gossip. "It would not be the worst thing, you know. You have been alone long enough." For once, Julia did not bristle at the observation. "Perhaps you are right." Sunday arrived clear and warm, perfect weather for riding. Julia dressed carefully, choosing her most practical riding dress and braiding her hair securely. At the livery, she found William waiting with 2 horses, hers already saddled and ready. Her father's old gelding, Copper, nickered in recognition, and she felt a pang of guilt for neglecting him these past years. "Thank you for having him prepared," she said, stroking Copper's nose. "It was my pleasure." William helped her mount, his hands steady at her waist, then swung onto his own horse with practiced ease. "The ranch is about an hour's ride north. Beautiful country out that way." They rode out of town at an easy pace, following trails that wound through stands of oak and hickory, across streams still running with spring melt, past meadows where wildflowers bloomed in profusion. Julia had forgotten how much she enjoyed riding, the freedom of it, the way the world opened up beyond the confines of her shop and apartment. Copper seemed happy to be out as well, stepping lively beneath her, ears pricked forward with interest. William pointed out landmarks as they rode, telling her about the area's history, the Cherokee families who had lived here for generations, the complicated mix of cultures that made the Indian Territory unique. He spoke with genuine respect for the land and its people, without the casual dismissiveness Julia had heard from so many white settlers. "My mother was quarter Cherokee," he said when she commented on his knowledge. "She made sure I understood that we were guests here, that this land had a history long before people like us arrived. I have tried to honor that. I did not know that about you. There is a lot we do not know about each other yet." William's smile was warm, "But we have time to learn." The ranch, when they reached it, was both more and less than Julia had expected. The house was small but solidly built, with good bones, as William had said, though it clearly needed repairs and fresh paint. The barn was in better shape, and there were several outbuildings that could be restored to usefulness. But what struck Julia most was the land itself, rolling hills and good grass, a stream cutting through the eastern section, stands of timber for building and fuel. It was a place with genuine potential, somewhere a person could build a life. "What do you think?" William asked, watching her face anxiously. "I think it is beautiful," Julia said honestly. "I think it will take a lot of work, but it could be something really special." They dismounted and William showed her around, pointing out what he planned to repair first, where he wanted to build additional corrals, his ideas for stocking the land with cattle. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Julia found herself offering suggestions, thinking about how the space could be made more livable, more like a home. They ate a picnic lunch that William had packed, sitting in the shade of a large oak near the house. The food was simple but good, and the company was better. Julia felt more relaxed than she had in years, the constant tension she carried seeming to ease in this peaceful place with this thoughtful man. "I can see you here," she said suddenly. "I can imagine you making this into something wonderful." "Can you see yourself here too?" William's question was quiet, careful. Julia met his gaze, understanding the deeper question beneath the words. "I do not know yet, but I would like to find out." William reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "That is all I am asking for. Time to see where this might go. No pressure, no expectations. just the chance to discover what we might become together." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, watching the sun move across the sky. Julia felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of grief and isolation beginning to unwind. It was not healed, not yet, maybe not for a long time. But it was changing, softening, making room for something new. The ride back to Tahlequah was quieter but comfortable, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the livery and William helped her dismount, his hands lingered at her waist. "Thank you for today," he said. "It meant more than you might realize, sharing this with you." "Thank you for inviting me." Julia found herself reluctant to step away. "When will I see you again?" "As often as you will allow." William smiled. "I need to spend the next few days finalizing the property purchase and starting on repairs, but I will be in town by week's end. Perhaps we could have supper again. My turn to cook this time." "I would like that." He kissed her hand, a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and perfect, then mounted his horse and rode off toward his hotel. Julia walked back to her shop slowly, her mind full of possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider in years. The next week passed in a blur of work and anticipation. Julia threw herself into her leatherwork with renewed energy, taking on new projects, experimenting with designs she had been too listless to attempt before. Several customers commented on the change in her, the new lightness in her demeanor, the way she actually smiled when they entered the shop. William came by on Wednesday, dusty and tired but happy. The property was his, the papers signed and filed. He was moving out of the hotel and into the ranch house, despite its current state of disrepair. "I will be sleeping on the floor for a while," he admitted, "but it is mine." "That makes all the difference." "You will need furniture," Julia said practically, "and curtains and a dozen other things to make it livable." "I suppose I will." William grinned. "Perhaps you could help me figure out what is needed. You seem to have better sense about such things than I do." They spent the evening going through catalogs from the general store, making lists of essentials, laughing over William's complete ignorance of domestic necessities. He had been living in bunkhouses and hotels for so long that the concept of maintaining a real household was almost foreign to him. "You need dishes," Julia said, trying not to laugh at his confused expression, "and pots and pans for cooking, and blankets and towels and soap." "I have soap, the kind for laundry, not just bathing, and lye for cleaning, and a broom and mop." She shook her head in amused disbelief. "How have you survived this long?" "Very poorly, apparently." William looked at the growing list with something like dismay. "This is going to cost more than I thought. That is what happens when you become a homeowner instead of a drifter." Julia's tone was teasing but kind. "Welcome to settled life." Over the next few weeks, William divided his time between working on the ranch and spending evenings with Julia. They fell into an easy routine, meeting for meals, taking walks through town, occasionally riding out to the ranch so she could see his progress. Julia found herself thinking about him constantly, missing him when he was away, feeling her heart lift whenever she heard his knock on her door. The change in her did not go unnoticed in Tahlequah. The town gossips had a field day with the development, speculating endlessly about the nature of Julia and William's relationship, making predictions about engagement announcements and wedding dates. Julia tried to ignore them, but she could not deny that her life had transformed dramatically in a very short time. "I am different," she confessed to William one evening as they sat on her small balcony, watching the sun set. "I feel like I am waking up from a long sleep. Everything seems brighter, more possible." "You are not different," William said gently. "You are just remembering who you were before grief took over. This was always in you, Julia. You just needed someone to help you find it again." She leaned against his shoulder, feeling safe and content in a way she had not experienced since childhood. "What about you? Have I changed you too, completely?" William's arm came around her, holding her close. "I came to Tahlequah looking for a place to settle, but I found so much more. I found purpose and connection, and something I think might be love if we give it time to grow." Julia's breath caught. They had been carefully dancing around the deeper emotions building between them, acknowledging the attraction and affection, but not naming the larger feelings developing beneath. Hearing William speak of love, even hypothetically, made her heart race. "I think I am falling in love with you," she said quietly, the admission both terrifying and freeing. "I did not plan to. I did not think I was capable of it anymore, but it is happening anyway." William turned to face her fully, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "I am already there. I think I started falling the moment I walked into your shop and saw you stitching all that sadness into the leather. I wanted to help carry it, to give you something lighter to work with. Stitch our lives together," Julia whispered, "instead of sadness." "Yes." William's smile was radiant. "Exactly that. Stitch our lives together and I will carry the joy. Whatever sadness remains, we will share it. But the joy, the good things, let me be the one to hold those for you until you are strong enough to hold them yourself." Julia felt tears sliding down her face, but they were good tears, cleansing tears. "I want that. I want all of it. You, the ranch, a life we build together. I want to stop being afraid." William kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise. It was Julia's first real kiss, and it felt like coming home after a long journey through foreign lands. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were beginning. "We should probably make this official," William said, his voice unsteady with emotion. "Julia Kennedy, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a reformed drifter who wants nothing more than to build a life with you?" "Yes," Julia said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, absolutely yes." They stayed on the balcony long into the night, making plans, dreaming aloud, holding each other as the stars wheeled overhead. Julia felt as though she had stepped from darkness into light, from isolation into connection, from merely surviving into genuinely living. The sadness that had defined her for so long was still there, would probably always be part of her in some way, but it no longer controlled her. Now there was room for joy, for love, for hope. The engagement announcement caused quite a stir in Tahlequah. Some people were delighted, declaring that they had seen it coming from the start. Others were shocked that the reclusive leatherworker had agreed to marry anyone, let alone someone she had known for barely 2 months. But Julia found she did not care about the gossip. She was too happy, too focused on her future with William to worry about what others thought. They decided on a simple ceremony at the church, with just a few close friends attending. Julia had no family left, and William's was long gone, so they would build their own family, create their own traditions. The wedding was set for late September, giving them time to make the ranch house more livable and for Julia to arrange her business affairs. The question of the leather shop caused some debate. William wanted Julia to give it up entirely, arguing that the ranch would need all their combined efforts to succeed. But Julia was reluctant to abandon the trade that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her life. "It is part of who I am," she explained as they discussed it one evening. "I know you need help with the ranch and I want to give that help, but I also need something that is just mine, a skill and a purpose beyond being your wife." William was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You are right. I was being selfish, thinking only about what would be convenient for me. What if we moved the shop out to the ranch? You could have a workspace in one of the outbuildings, take commissions as you have time. That way you keep your trade but are still present for the ranch work." That could work. Julia felt relief flooding through her. I would need to maintain some presence in town too, a way for customers to reach me. Perhaps I could arrange with Mr. Chen to take orders at the general store and deliver finished work there. They worked out the details over the following weeks, making arrangements that would allow Julia to continue her leather work while also participating in ranch life. It was a compromise that satisfied them both, a recognition that their marriage would be a partnership of equals rather than a traditional arrangement where the wife simply subsumed herself into the husband's life. As summer deepened into early autumn, Julia and William worked together to prepare the ranch house. They painted walls, repaired floors, hung curtains that Julia sewed herself. Furniture arrived from catalogs, dishes and pots, and all the domestic equipment that William had lived without for so long. Julia moved her leather working tools and supplies out to one of the outbuildings, setting up a proper workspace with good light and ample room. The physical labor was exhausting but satisfying, each improvement bringing them closer to making the ranch a true home. They worked side by side during the days, learning each other's rhythms and habits, discovering how to move as a team. In the evenings, they would collapse together on the porch, too tired to do more than hold hands and watch the sunset, but deeply content. Julia had not been this happy in years, perhaps ever. The joy was almost frightening in its intensity, making her worry sometimes that it could not last, that something would happen to steal it away. William seemed to sense these moments of fear, pulling her close and reminding her that happiness was not something to be feared but embraced. "We are allowed to be happy," he would say. "The people we lost would want that for us. Honor them by living fully, not by drowning in perpetual grief." His words helped, giving Julia permission to fully inhabit her new life without guilt. She thought often about her parents, about what they would make of William and the ranch and her impending marriage. She liked to believe they would be pleased, that they would see how William had helped her rediscover herself, had given her a reason to stitch joy instead of sadness. The wedding day arrived cool and clear, perfect September weather. Julia wore a simple but lovely dress she had made herself, cream-colored with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. William wore his best clothes, looking handsome and impossibly young, his eyes bright with emotion as he watched her walk down the aisle. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, traditional vows exchanged in steady voices. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, William kissed Julia with such tenderness that several people in attendance wiped away tears. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the church hall with food and music and well wishes from the community. Mrs. Patterson cornered Julia at one point, her eyes suspiciously moist. "I am happy for you, dear. You deserve this. You have been alone in your grief long enough." "Thank you," Julia said, meaning it, "for caring even when I made it difficult. That is what community is for." Mrs. Patterson squeezed her hand. "Now go dance with your husband and start your new life." The celebration lasted into the evening, but eventually Julia and William escaped, riding back to the ranch under a sky full of stars. They were both nervous, aware that this night marked a new level of intimacy between them, but the nervousness was mixed with excitement and deep trust. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, full of whispered words and gentle discovery. Julia had been afraid she would not know how to be a wife in this way, but William was patient and loving, making her feel cherished and safe. When they finally fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, Julia felt complete in a way she had never experienced before. The weeks that followed established the pattern of their married life. William worked the ranch, building the herd, maintaining fences and buildings, planning for future expansion. Julia divided her time between helping him and her leatherwork, finding satisfaction in both roles. They hired a young Cherokee man named Tom to help with the heavier ranch work, giving them more time together. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. They woke early, worked hard through the day, spent evenings together in their small house, talking and planning and simply being together. Julia discovered she loved cooking for William, seeing his appreciation for the meals she prepared. William proved surprisingly handy at domestic tasks, never treating housework as beneath him, pitching in with laundry and cleaning without being asked. Neighbors began visiting, curious about the new couple at the Hayes Ranch. Julia, who had avoided social interactions for so long, found herself actually enjoying the company, hosting dinners and participating in the community activities she had shunned during her years of isolation. William was popular in the area, respected for his work ethic and fairness in business dealings, and Julia found herself welcomed as his wife. As winter approached, they worked to prepare the ranch for the cold months ahead. They stocked supplies, repaired buildings against the weather, laid in feed for the animals. It was during one of these preparation sessions that Julia realized her monthly courses had not come. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely, but when another month passed with no sign, she knew. She told William one evening as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside, "I think I am going to have a baby." William's face went through a remarkable series of expressions before settling on pure joy. "Truly, you are certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation, but yes, I think so." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "This is wonderful. The best news possible." Julia felt tears on her cheeks, overwhelmed by the reality of it. A baby, a child to raise and love, to fill their house with laughter and life. It was more than she had ever let herself hope for during those long years of solitude. "I am scared," she admitted. "What if I am not good at this? What if something goes wrong? We will figure it out together." William's voice was steady, confident. "Whatever comes, we will face it as a team, and you will be a wonderful mother. I have no doubts about that." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and into spring. Julia continued working as long as she could, though she had to give up some of the heavier tasks as her belly grew. William became almost comically protective, worrying about her constantly, insisting she rest far more than she felt necessary. She found his concern endearing, even when it became excessive. The baby arrived in early June, a long and difficult labor that left Julia exhausted but triumphant. William stayed with her throughout, holding her hand, offering encouragement, looking slightly terrified but refusing to leave. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Julia's arms, William's face was wet with tears. "A boy," the midwife announced, "healthy and strong." They named him Daniel James Hayes, and he was perfect. Tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. Julia held him and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known possible, love flooding through her with overwhelming force. This child, created from the love she shared with William, represented everything good and hopeful in her new life. William was a devoted father from the start, taking to parenthood with the same steady competence he brought to everything. He would walk Daniel around the house in the middle of the night when the baby fussed, singing quietly, his deep voice somehow always calming. Julia would wake to find them like that sometimes, father and son silhouetted against the window, and her heart would ache with happiness. The first year of Daniel's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. The ranch continued to prosper, William's careful management paying off in steady growth. Julia's leatherwork business remained steady as well, though she took fewer commissions now, focusing her energy on their son and the household. They celebrated Daniel's first birthday with a party that drew neighbors from miles around. The baby, now a toddling, curious child with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, was the center of attention, soaking up the admiration with gleeful enthusiasm. Julia watched him and felt profound gratitude for how far she had come. From the sad, isolated woman stitching grief into leather to this happy wife and mother surrounded by community. That evening, after the guests had departed and Daniel was asleep, Julia and William sat on their porch watching the sunset. William's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, perfect contentment settling over them both. "Do you remember what you said that first day in the shop?" Julia asked. "About me stitching sadness into the leather, I remember. I have been thinking about that lately, about how much has changed. I do not stitch sadness anymore. Now when I work, I am thinking about you, about Daniel, about the life we have built. I am stitching joy now." William kissed the top of her head. "And I carry that joy, just as I promised. Every day, Julia. I carry the happiness of our life together and consider myself the luckiest man alive." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the sounds of the ranch settling around them. Julia thought about the journey that had brought her here, the grief that had nearly consumed her, the loneliness that had defined her existence for so long. She thought about the cowboy who had walked into her shop one dusty afternoon and somehow seen past her walls to the woman beneath. Their lives together were not perfect. There were hard days, disagreements, challenges that tested them. The ranch demanded constant work. Money was sometimes tight, and raising a child brought its own complications. But through it all, they had each other, their partnership strong and true. As the years passed, the Hayes Ranch became one of the most successful in the area. William's reputation for fairness and quality stock spread, bringing buyers from distant territories. Julia's leatherwork remained in demand, her reputation growing as word spread of the skill and artistry she brought to each piece. They added to the house, creating more space as their family grew. Daniel was joined by a daughter 2 years later, Emma Grace, who had her mother's quiet determination and her father's easy charm. Then came another son, Michael Thomas, who was all energy and mischief from the day he could crawl. The house that had once seemed too large for just Julia and William now rang with children's voices, with laughter and occasional tears, with all the beautiful chaos of family life. Julia sometimes caught herself pausing in her work, overwhelmed by the fullness of her existence. The transformation from isolated grief to abundant joy still sometimes surprised her, even years into her marriage. She would look around at her children, her thriving home, her strong and loving husband, and marvel at how much had changed from that day when William first walked into her shop. She kept the photograph of her parents on the mantel, honoring their memory while no longer being trapped by it. She taught her children about their grandparents, keeping those stories alive, but she no longer lived in the past. The present was too rich, too full of life and love and possibility to waste time dwelling on what was gone. William remained her partner in every sense, sharing the work and the worry and the joy of building their life together. He never took credit for Julia's transformation, always insisting that the strength and resilience had been in her all along, that he had simply provided an opportunity for it to emerge. But Julia knew better. William had saved her in the most fundamental way, not by rescuing her but by seeing her, by offering connection when she had resigned herself to perpetual isolation. On their 10th anniversary, they took a rare day away from the ranch and the children, riding back to the spot where William had first shown her the property. The land was transformed now, the ranch house large and well-maintained, the barns full, the pastures dotted with healthy cattle. But the big oak where they had shared their first picnic remained unchanged, still spreading its branches in welcome shade. They sat beneath it as they had a decade before, older now, marked by the years of hard work but still deeply in love. Julia held William's hand, running her thumb over the calluses earned from ranch work, feeling the solid reality of him beside her. "You regret it?" William asked suddenly. "Giving up your solitary life for all this chaos?" Julia looked at him in surprise. "Not for a single moment." "You gave me back my life, William. You taught me that I could be more than just my grief, that there was room for joy even after tremendous loss. How could I ever regret that? I worry sometimes that it was too much too fast, that I pushed you into this before you were ready. You gave me exactly what I needed exactly when I needed it." Julia shifted to face him fully. "I would have wasted my whole life in that shop, slowly dying inside, if you had not walked through the door and refused to let me hide. You saw me when I could not see myself. That is not something to regret." William pulled her close, his face buried in her hair. "I love you, more now than I did on our wedding day, which I would not have thought possible. You have made me happier than I ever imagined I could be, and you have made me whole again." Julia felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. "You told me once to stitch our lives together, that you would carry the joy. You have kept that promise every single day." They stayed beneath the oak until sunset, talking about the past and the future, about their children and their hopes, about the life they had built and the life still ahead of them. When they finally rode back to the ranch, the house was glowing with lamplight, their children visible through the windows waiting for their return. This was home, Julia thought as they dismounted and were immediately swarmed by excited children demanding to know about their day. This noise and chaos and overwhelming love, this was what she had been missing during all those years of quiet isolation. William caught her eye over the children's heads, his expression warm with understanding and shared contentment. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was finally quiet, Julia returned to her workshop. She had a commission to finish, a saddle for a local rancher who had requested her finest work. As she picked up her tools and bent over the leather, she realized she was humming, the same tune her mother used to sing but with new words forming in her mind. Words about cowboys and second chances, about love finding you when you least expected it, about the courage to let joy in after profound sorrow. She stitched carefully, each movement practiced and sure, but the emotion flowing through her hands into the leather was completely different from the sadness she had once worked into every piece. This saddle carried hope, love, contentment, all the bright emotions that colored her life now. Someone would ride on this saddle for years, and though they would never know it, they would be carried by joy stitched into every seam. William appeared in the doorway of her workshop, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might want company, always." Julia accepted the coffee gratefully, making room for him on the bench beside her. "I was just thinking about that first saddle I repaired for you, how different everything was then." "You were so sad," William said quietly. "I could see it in your eyes, in the way you held yourself. It hurt to watch, and you decided to do something about it. I decided to try. I had no idea if it would work, if you would even give me a chance, but I had to try." He set down his coffee and took her hand. "You were worth the effort, Julia, you always were." They sat together in the workshop, hands entwined, surrounded by the tools of Julia's trade and the comfortable silence of deep understanding. Outside, the ranch slept peacefully under a vast expanse of stars. Inside, 2 hearts beat in quiet synchronization, stitched together by love and commitment and shared experience. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Daniel grew into a serious, responsible young man who loved working the ranch with his father. Emma proved to have her mother's gift for leatherwork, spending hours in the workshop learning the trade. Michael remained the wild one, always pushing boundaries, always dreaming of adventures beyond the ranch's borders. Julia and William grew older together, silver threading through their hair, lines deepening around their eyes, but their love remained constant. They still made time for each other, still took evening walks and shared quiet conversations, still looked at each other with the wonder of people who had found something precious and refused to take it for granted. Julia's reputation as a leatherworker spread far beyond Tahlequah, with orders coming from across the territory and beyond. She could have made a fortune if she had wanted to focus entirely on the business, but she kept it manageable, preferring to balance work with family and ranch responsibilities. Quality over quantity, she always said, each piece given the attention and care it deserved. William's ranch became one of the most respected in the region, known for healthy stock and honest dealing. He served on local councils, helped neighbors in times of trouble, and raised his children to understand the value of community and hard work. The angry, grieving drifter he had once been seemed like a distant memory, transformed by love and purpose into a pillar of the community. On their 20th anniversary, their children organized a surprise celebration, inviting friends and neighbors from throughout the area. The ranch was packed with people, all wanting to honor the couple who had become such an important part of the community's fabric. Julia found herself surrounded by well-wishers, telling her how much her work had meant to them, how her friendship had enriched their lives. William sought her out in the crowd, taking her hand and pulling her aside to a quiet corner. Overwhelmed, a little, Julia leaned against him gratefully. "I keep thinking about the woman I used to be, so isolated and alone. She would never have believed this was possible. But you believed enough to take a chance." William's arms came around her, holding her close despite the party continuing around them. "That took courage, Julia. More courage than most people ever show. You made it easy to be brave." She looked up at him, this man who had changed her life so completely. "You have given me everything, William. Family, home, purpose, love. How can I ever thank you enough? By being exactly who you are. That has always been enough." He kissed her gently, not caring who might see. "I love you, Julia Hayes, today and always." The celebration continued long into the night, but eventually the guests departed and the family was alone again. They sat on the porch, all 5 of them, watching the stars come out. Daniel talked about his plans for expanding the herd. Emma showed off her latest leatherwork project. Michael, now 16 and full of restless energy, spoke of his desire to see more of the country before settling down. Julia listened to her children's voices, felt William's solid presence beside her, and experienced a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was what happiness looked like. Not the absence of difficulty or challenge, but the presence of love and purpose and connection. It was waking up each morning knowing you were exactly where you belonged, with people who mattered, doing work that had meaning. She thought about the title she had once claimed for herself, the lonely leatherworker stitching sadness into everything she touched. That woman was gone, transformed by love and time into someone entirely different. Now she was Julia Hayes, wife and mother, respected artisan and community member, a woman who had learned to stitch joy into every aspect of her life. And beside her was William, the cowboy who had refused to let her remain trapped in grief, who had offered to stitch their lives together and carry the joy until she was strong enough to hold it herself. He had kept that promise for 20 years, through good times and bad, through the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up a life shared. As the children eventually drifted off to bed, Julia and William remained on the porch, reluctant to end the perfect evening. The ranch was quiet around them, the animals settled, the land peaceful under the night sky. 20 years, William said softly. It has gone so fast, and so slow. Julia smiled. I feel like I've lived a lifetime with you and also like we just got started. We have a lot of life left ahead of us. Daniel will marry soon, I think. He has been spending a lot of time with the Miller girl, and Emma is turning into quite the businesswoman with her leather work. Michael will probably leave for a while, but I think he will come back eventually. The ranch is in his blood. And then there will be grandchildren. Julia felt a flutter of excitement at the thought. Can you imagine? Us as grandparents, I can imagine it just fine. You will be wonderful at it, spoiling them and teaching them and sending them home full of sugar and stories. William laughed quietly. I cannot wait. They sat in companionable silence, thinking about the future that stretched ahead of them. More years together, watching their children build their own lives, welcoming new generations, continuing to work the land and craft leather and build community. It was a good future, full of promise and possibility. Julia stood eventually, pulling William up with her. Come to bed. Tomorrow starts early as always. One more moment. William held her there on the porch, his arms around her, swaying slightly as though to music only they could hear. I want to remember this. This perfect night, this perfect life. I want to hold it in my memory forever. It is not perfect, Julia said, but she was smiling. We have had our struggles, our disagreements, our hard times, but it is ours. Every bit of it, the good and the difficult, we have faced it together. That makes it perfect to me. Julia reached up and cupped his face in her hands, this man who had saved her and been saved in return, who had shown her that love was not something to fear, but something to embrace with both hands and an open heart. I love you, William Hayes. Thank you for not letting me hide, for insisting I could be more than my grief, for stitching our lives together with such care. Thank you for saying yes. William kissed her, deep and long and full of 20 years of love and commitment, to everything, to marriage, to family, to this life. Thank you for saying yes. They went inside together, closing the door on another day in their life together. Upstairs, their children slept safely, dreaming their own dreams. Outside, the ranch that William had built and Julia had helped turn into a home stood solid against the night. And in their bedroom, husband and wife held each other close, grateful for what they had found, for what they had built, for the journey that had brought them from loneliness to love. Years continued to flow past like water in the stream that ran through their property. Daniel did marry Sarah Miller, and they built a house on the far corner of the Hayes Ranch, starting their own family while still remaining close. Emma established a thriving leatherwork business that eventually exceeded her mother's reputation, her pieces sought after throughout the territory and beyond. Michael left for several years, working on ranches throughout the West, but returned eventually as William had predicted, ready to settle down and help run the family operation. Julia and William aged gracefully into their roles as patriarch and matriarch of a growing family. Grandchildren arrived, bringing new energy and joy to the ranch. Julia taught them to work leather as her father had taught her, passing down skills and stories. William showed them how to care for animals and land, instilling in them the values that had guided his life. On their 30th anniversary, the family gathered again, now including spouses and grandchildren, a crowd that filled the expanded house to bursting. Julia looked around at the sea of faces, all connected to her and William, all part of the legacy they had built together, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after the celebration had wound down and most people had departed, Julia returned to her workshop. She had maintained it all these years, still taking occasional commissions, still finding satisfaction in the ancient craft of working leather. Tonight, she wanted to make something special, a gift for William that would express everything she felt. She worked through the night, her old hands still skilled despite their age, creating a belt with intricate tooling that told the story of their life together. A lonely leatherworker, a wandering cowboy, two hearts that found each other and chose connection over isolation. The leather flowed through her hands as it always had, but now it carried joy, love, gratitude, all the bright emotions that had defined these 3 decades together. As dawn broke, she finished the final stitch and held up the completed belt. It was some of her finest work, every detail perfect, every element meaningful. William would understand the story it told, would recognize the symbols and images that represented their journey. She found him on the porch, watching the sunrise as he often did, coffee in hand and a look of peaceful contentment on his weathered face. Julia sat beside him, presenting the belt with shy pride. For you, for 30 years of carrying the joy. William examined the belt slowly, his fingers tracing the tooled leather, reading the story she had stitched into it. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It is beautiful, Julia, the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." He buckled it on immediately, running his hands over it with reverence. "I will wear it every day for the rest of my life." "You have given me everything," Julia said, her own eyes wet. "A life I never thought possible, happiness beyond my wildest dreams. This belt is a poor thank you for all that." "You gave me just as much." William took her hand, holding it between both of his. "I was lost before I found you, drifting through life with no purpose or direction. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to plant roots and build something lasting. We saved each other, Julia. That is what real love does." They sat together watching the sun climb higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The ranch woke around them, animals stirring, people beginning their daily routines. Somewhere inside the house, a grandchild laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the morning air. "You think we will have many more years?" Julia asked suddenly, voicing a fear that had been growing as they aged. "I hope so. But however many we have, we will make them count." William squeezed her hand. "And when our time comes, we will face that together too. No fear, no regrets, just gratitude for everything we have shared." "No regrets," Julia agreed. "How could I regret any of this?" They did have more years, a full decade more, during which their family continued to grow and prosper. Julia worked leather until her hands grew too stiff to hold the tools steadily, then transitioned to teaching, passing her knowledge to Emma's daughters and anyone else who wanted to learn. William remained active on the ranch until his early 70s, when he finally admitted he needed to let Daniel and Michael handle the heavy work. But they were together through all of it, facing each day side by side, their love deepening with every passing year. They had long since stopped being two separate people and become instead a single unit, each half of an inseparable whole. On a spring morning in their 43rd year of marriage, William did not wake up. He died peacefully in his sleep, Julia beside him as she had been for over 4 decades. She woke to find him gone, his hand still holding hers, his face peaceful and free from pain. The grief was profound, a physical ache that seemed to hollow her out from the inside. But even in her sorrow, Julia knew she had been blessed beyond measure. 43 years of love, of partnership, of joy. How many people could say they had been that fortunate? The funeral drew people from throughout the territory, all wanting to pay respects to a man who had lived with integrity and kindness. Julia stood surrounded by her children and grandchildren, drawing strength from the family that she and William had created together. This was his legacy, she thought. Not just the successful ranch or the respected name, but these people, this love that would continue long after he was gone. In the weeks after, Julia found comfort in routine and in her family's presence. They rallied around her, making sure she was never alone for long, that she had everything she needed. Daniel took over full management of the ranch. Emma stayed close, helping her mother through the worst of the grief. Michael, who had inherited his father's gift for seeing into people's hearts, sat with her for long hours, letting her talk about William, keeping his memory alive through shared stories. One evening, alone in the house that suddenly felt too large and too empty, Julia went to her workshop. She had not worked leather since William's death, had not felt capable of it. But tonight, something pulled her back to the craft that had defined so much of her life. She selected a piece of fine leather and began to work, not toward any particular commission or goal, but simply to create. Her hands remembered the motions even if they were slower now, the needle pulling through leather with familiar resistance. As she worked, she realized she was making a journal cover, something to hold the story of her life. And as the leather took shape beneath her hands, Julia understood that she was stitching something new now. Not sadness as she had in those long-ago days before William, not just joy as she had during their years together. Now she was stitching gratitude, memory, and acceptance. She was stitching the story of a love that had transformed her life, that had given her everything she had never known to hope for. The work took weeks, but Julia poured herself into it, creating something that was as much art as craft. When it was finished, she began writing in the journal, recording everything she could remember about her life with William. The day they met, his words about stitching sadness, his proposal, their wedding, the birth of their children, all the thousands of small moments that had added up to a life together. She wrote for her children, for her grandchildren, for generations yet to come. She wrote so they would know how much their grandfather had loved them, how hard he had worked to build something lasting, how he had turned a grieving, isolated woman into someone capable of joy and connection. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, Julia continued writing, the journal growing thick with memories and love. She still missed William with an ache that never quite left, but she found peace in remembering, in celebrating what they had shared rather than only mourning what was lost. Her grandchildren visited often, climbing into her lap to hear stories about their grandfather, the cowboy who had ridden into town with a torn saddle and left with a wife and a future. Julia told them everything, shaping their grandfather into a real person rather than just a memory, making sure they understood the kind of man he had been. On what would have been their 44th anniversary, Julia returned to the oak tree where William had first shown her the ranch. It was autumn now, the leaves turning gold and red, the air crisp with the promise of winter. She spread a blanket beneath the tree and sat, the journal in her lap, and read aloud every word she had written. It felt like a gift, an offering, a way of letting William know that she remembered, that she honored what they had built together. When she finished reading, she sat in silence, feeling the wind move through the branches above her, imagining it was William's presence, still watching over her and the family they had created. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind, to the tree, to whatever remained of the man she had loved. "For everything. For seeing me when I could not see myself, for refusing to let me hide, for stitching our lives together so completely. You kept your promise, William. You carried the joy, and you taught me to carry it too. I will honor that lesson for whatever time I have left." Julia lived for 3 more years after William's death. Years filled with family and purpose, and continued contribution to the community. She saw 2 more great-grandchildren born, ensured the leather workshop was properly passed to Emma and her daughters, and made sure every member of her family knew they were loved beyond measure. When her time finally came, she went peacefully, surrounded by children and grandchildren, her hand holding the journal that contained the story of her life with William. Her last words were a whisper, meant for ears that had been still for years, but that she believed somehow could still hear her. "I am coming. Wait for me." The funeral was enormous, drawing people from across the territory and beyond. Julia Kennedy Hayes had touched countless lives through her craft, her kindness, and her example of how to live fully even after profound loss. The eulogy was delivered by her grandson, Daniel's oldest son, who spoke of a woman who had learned to stitch joy instead of sadness, who had turned a chance encounter with a cowboy into a love story for the ages. They buried her beside William, beneath a stone that bore both their names and a simple inscription: 2 hearts, 1 life, stitched together with love. The Hayes Ranch continued under family management for generations, each new heir learning the story of Julia and William, the leatherworker and the cowboy who had found each other in the Indian Territory town of Tahlequah and built something that lasted far beyond their mortal years. Emma's daughters and granddaughters continued the leatherworking tradition, each piece still carrying the quality and care that Julia had insisted upon. And though styles changed and techniques evolved, they always remembered the lesson at the heart of their craft: that what you stitch into the leather matters, that your emotions flow through your hands into your work, that you choose whether to create from sadness or joy. The journal Julia had made, the one containing the complete story of her life with William, became a family treasure, passed down and added to by each generation. The leather cover she had crafted remained supple and beautiful, testament to her skill and the care she had put into creating it. And on anniversaries and special occasions, family members would gather beneath the old oak tree where it all began, where a drifting cowboy had shared a picnic with a grieving leatherworker and convinced her to take a chance on happiness. They would read from the journal, sharing the story with new generations, making sure that Julia and William's love remained alive in memory and in the family they had built together. The land itself seemed to remember them, the ranch prospering year after year, the workshop always producing fine leather goods, the house filled with love and laughter just as Julia and William had dreamed. Their great-great-grandchildren played in the same meadows where their own children had run, rode horses along the same trails, learned the same values of hard work and integrity and community. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moved just right through the oak tree's branches, those who listened closely swore they could hear it, the echo of a promise kept, and a love that refused to die. The sound of 2 hearts beating as one, of a leatherworker who learned to stitch joy instead of sadness, of a cowboy who kept his word to carry that joy for all the days of his life and beyond. This was their legacy, this ranch and this family, and this enduring story of how love could transform grief into gratitude, isolation into connection, sadness into joy. It was a story worth remembering, worth sharing, worth stitching into the very fabric of family history so that it would never be lost. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the acres or the buildings or even the successful business, but the love story at the heart of it all. The story of Julia and William Hayes, who had found each other when both needed saving, who had stitched their lives together with care and patience and unwavering commitment, who had proven that it was never too late to choose joy over sorrow, connection over isolation, love over fear. Their story continued to inspire, generation after generation finding hope and courage in the example of two people who had refused to let loss define them, who had chosen instead to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their hearts. That was the true inheritance they left behind, far more valuable than land or money or anything material. They had left behind love, the kind of love that transformed everything it touched, that echoed through time, that proved beyond doubt that choosing to live fully and love completely was always worth whatever risk it required. That was Julia and William's gift to their descendants and to anyone who heard their story. The knowledge that happiness was possible even after the deepest sorrow, that love could heal even the most wounded heart, that it was never too late to become someone new. And so their story lived on, told and retold, cherished and honored, a testament to the power of two hearts choosing to stitch their lives together, to carry joy instead of sadness, to build love instead of dwelling in loss. It was a story that would last as long as there were people to tell it, as long as the oak tree stood, as long as the wind moved across the Oklahoma land, where two lonely souls had once found each other and created something that would last forever.